We're looking at linkage institutions, and we're now on to interest groups. So we have a few cards on that. Probably take a couple lessons to get through it. Right now, we got about 3 cards we're going to go through on interest groups. You might remember that in the Federalist Papers, interest groups were known as factions, but that's kind of the same idea here. All right, let's go on in backside. 5.21 interest groups. All right, so interest groups, by the way, can be very specific, like the National Rifle Association, like it's a kind of a one issue interest group, or a more general interest group like the AARP, the Association of American Retired Persons. And you have that's like anybody over 50 years old that can belong to the AARP, and their issues are anything having to do with people over age 50. So it's a lot of things. That also encompasses Social Security, Medicare, and some other programs, but it's just in general care for people over 50. So you can be very specific, you can be very general. One of the things that interest groups get a lot of power from and influence is because they will have people that have technical and scientific expertise on the issue or in the issue. So they're going to have technical or scientific expertise in the issue. So if Congress is doing a hearing on a bill, or the bureaucracy is holding some sort of conditions or talking about some sort of regulation, then they'll bring in interest group experts to talk about the topic, because those people, an environmental group, economic group, whatever the issue may be, there's an interest group that probably has some sort of scientific or technical expertise on it, and so that gives them influence. Also, kind of like a political party, here's one overlap here. Political parties, remember, their job is to win elections, but interest groups definitely want to educate voters and office holders. So one of their jobs is, yes, just like a political party, to educate voters, but they also educate the office holders. So interest groups are often meeting with Congress people and office holders across the nation to try to influence them with their expertise, to try to get them on board with some piece of legislation that probably has been written by the interest group. Matter of fact, let's talk about that. The next thing is draft legislation. Draft legislation. Although a bill cannot be entered into Congress except by a Congress member, legislation can be drafted by other people and then given to a person in Congress. So interest groups, matter of fact, write more legislation than any other type of groups. Matter of fact, look at this little chart here. Industry wrote 1,151 copies of law, and that just basically means drafted a bill. And industry is all kinds of different interest groups. Different industry groups. So that's like, you see that interest groups are drafting legislation, influencing office holders, influencing the bureaucracy, and then getting their bills passed through Congress. They also will use their membership and mobilize it. Not necessarily to vote, because that's more of a party thing, but interest groups certainly probably would mobilize their voters, mobilize their members. Although if you're in an interest group and you're that hardcore, like, you're going to vote, like, that isn't really an issue. But they also will mobilize them to do protests or letter writing campaigns or contacting Congress people in order to try to influence politics. So especially the protesting and the letter writing is pretty big, or email, whatever you want to use. And then this is probably like the most common thing interest groups do, and that's apply pressure to legislatures and government agencies, meaning bureaucracy, and we know this as lobbying. So they try to influence the legislature in terms of passing bills, and government agencies, the bureaucracies, and this is known as lobbying. And remember this is from Unit 2, iron triangle relationship. So that's a big part of what interest groups do, is that lobbying, and they create these iron triangle relationships that give them tremendous power over legislation that gets passed. Okay, pause it if you need to, but that's it for that card. Just remember the iron triangle. You have a member of, or members of the bureaucratic agency. plus interest group plus legislative committee, and there's a pat my back, I pat yours kind of, I scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of thing going on here in terms of the iron triangle. All right, last card of this lesson, 5.22, interest group influence. Interest groups influence. So who do they influence? What's the major part of their influence? All right, one, they influence the party coalition. So political parties are influenced by interest groups because the coalition of a political party is made up of a lot of different interest groups. Their influence, which we just kind of hit on the last card, is they exert influence in the iron triangles. So they influence the bureaucracies and legislative committees. And when issue networks pop up, remember, issue networks are like short-term relationships on an issue. That interest groups will pop up and certainly have influence there as well. So they exert influence on. Okay, here's what they influence: bureaucratic agencies, congressional committees, and other interest groups. So that's the iron triangle. That's review. If you don't want to write that because you kind of know what an iron triangle is at this point, that's fine. I'm okay with that. When you're in college, you don't necessarily write everything the professor says. Lastly, when we talk about the bureaucracy, remember all the areas in green down below here are all the different departments that are in the executive branch. Notice that they're all connected to the executive branch. And so that's what they're trying to influence, is the rulemaking process of the bureaucracy, plus the legislative branch writing the bill. So they're trying to influence the legislature in the writing the bill, and then influencing the agencies down below. That's their big influence. There is an influence they can have on the judicial branch. Now we'll talk about that in a future card. All right, thanks. There's 3 things on the interest groups. Go ahead and study them. Thanks, guys.